So before we begin our detailed account of what courage is, we need to remind ourselves of a very important thing. We just finished talking about free choice and how this is a rational process of deliberation. But the key with all virtue, including courage, is not what we do with our individual choices, but the kind of character that we cultivate. Because all moral and virtuous action occurs in the heat of the moment, and therefore at the time that we don't have time to think. So what we're trying to do with our rational deliberation and choices is build the kind of character that allows us to do the rational thing at the time when we don't have time to be rational or think about it. If you remember, in a previous lecture, I used the illustration of my drill sergeant and the battlefield, where he said there were only two types of people on the battlefield, the quick and the dead. Why? Because in the heat of a battle, if you have to think about what's the correct thing to do, it's too late. You're dead. He who hesitates is not just lost, they're dead. And the moral life occurs in the heat of the moment, in a battlefield type of situation where we don't have time to think. And so the whole thing that's behind all of this is we're not just doing courageous things, we're doing courageous things to build a character that is courageous, that therefore allows us to do the right thing at the right time, in the right way, without having to deliberate about it. So our choices are important, but only in building the foundation. No one becomes courageous overnight. It's a lifetime process, Aristotle says. And that's why he thinks human flourishing or happiness is not something like a momentary feeling, but rather it is the end of a long process, more like a race. And no one wins a race until they're done with the race. Thus, the end of life tells us more about the quality of our life than what's going on in the middle of it. So with that in mind, let's talk about why courage is so important. Let's remind ourselves of this. It's important because of one silly, obvious truth. It's hard to do the right thing, isn't it? That's precisely why it's admirable. It's admirable because not everyone can do it. Very few people can do the right thing in an excellent way. So if it's hard, that means it's difficult. That means you face the prospect of suffering, of pain, when you do the right thing. Well, when you face that prospect, then you face fear, don't you? And therefore, in order to do the right thing, you need to control your fear. And that precisely is what courage is. We need to control our fear in order to do the right thing. And the control of fear, the character that allows us to sculpt our fear, is courage itself. And so we see that courage is all important. Without courage, we cannot be good. But Aristotle thinks that's what makes courage even more important than a virtue like temperance, because it is a lot harder to overcome and do the right thing through suffering and pain than it is to just forego pleasure. And so courage, therefore, is the first on his list of important virtues. So now that we understand the importance, the next question is, how do we do it? What is courage? What does courage involve? Well, it involves three things. And what he says is actually something which might seem counterintuitive to us. We might think that the courageous person is the person who just gets rid of all their fear, and therefore they're able to do what they want because they don't fear anything. Many of you have heard the famous saying by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And Aristotle would disagree with that. Fear in itself is not wrong. Fear is a natural reaction to danger. And if you don't have fear, then that is bad. Just like not having pain is bad for your body. So then the question isn't getting rid of fear. Courage is the act of sculpting that fear so that certain fears we cultivate, other fears we suppress, and all fears we moderate so that we feel neither too much fear in these situations nor too little fear. Too little fear is just as bad as too much fear. Again, we see the idea of virtue as it's just the right amount. It's the Goldilocks principle. So let's think about these each in more detail. Cultivating the right fears. Well, what kinds of fears do we need to cultivate? Again, remember, fear is a motivator. It motivates us to do things, to run away from things. So there are certain types of fear that motivate us in the right direction. These are the fears we cultivate, the fears that will actually spur us on to do the right thing. And so when we understand that, then we understand that we're not going to suppress these fears, because these fears, if we suppress them, will actually make us less courageous. They will make us less willing to go into danger. What kind of fears, therefore, are the ones that make us go into danger to do the difficult thing? Well, he gives two examples. The first example is the fear of doing the wrong thing, of being dishonorable, of being a bad person. Obviously, if I'm in a dangerous situation and I see that in order to save my friends, I must face death, and maybe these friends are not people that I especially like, but I fear that if I don't save them, then I will feel guilt, and I will have to live with the fact that I did the wrong thing and that I'm a despicable person. That's a fear I should cultivate, because that's the kind of fear that will overcome the other fear that prevents me from doing the right thing. But so thus, when I love what is noble and good enough that I fear not obtaining that nobility or that goodness, then that's the kind of fear that will overcome the kinds of fears that will paralyze me in a life-threatening or a painful situation. That's a good fear, Aristotle says. We should cultivate it. Another fear I've kind of hinted at, and that's the fear of harm coming to our loved ones. Again, what do I love? There are good things to love. There is my family, he says. There are those who are my fellow citizens, my fellow soldiers. For Aristotle, the prime example of a situation where courage is necessary is on the battlefield defending my country, because these people, our soldiers, are the ones who keep us safe, and they need most of all courage. And that kind of courage involves a fear that my friends, my comrades, those who I love will come to harm. And it's that kind of fear that overcomes the desire to live many times, and therefore allows me to sacrifice myself for my loved one. So now this tells us something about courage. It tells us that courage is not something that someone like Hannibal Lecter, remember Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, can have. Or that there can't be a courageous Nazi, someone who saves and does something wrong by overcoming fear, because fear is involved in courage. Fear of doing the wrong thing, fear of hurting the ones who are good, hurting goodness and nobility. Those kind of fears are necessary for courage. Those are the ones I'm going to be sculpting and increasing and encouraging in order to make myself truly a courageous person. And so therefore, someone who is evil and yet overcomes their fears in order to do evil can't be courageous for Aristotle. Yes, they may be brave in the sense of that they control their fear, but they do it for the wrong reasons. And they don't cultivate the right fear. It's not simply overcoming fear, it's cultivating the right fears. But this also tells us that a lot of the athletes that we admire, Aristotle would say, are not courageous, even if they have to overcome a lot of fear to do the athletically excellent thing. For example, athletes who are extreme sports enthusiasts, they jump out of planes to surf. They brave really dangerous situations. They do this and they do control their fear, but they do it for a trivial thing, not a noble or a good thing. They don't do it to defend those things that are honorable and the loved ones that they cherish, but rather they just simply do it to overcome fear because they enjoy the thrill. And Aristotle says, well, while that's okay, that's not courage. That's not the field of courage. And so this solves a problem that a lot of people have about courage in modern philosophy. A lot of them worry that courage isn't good in itself because the Nazi can be courageous. Aristotle's answer? The Nazi can't be courageous because the Nazi is going after a dishonorable and despicable goal, and thus they overcome their fear, but they do it by cultivating the wrong fears and by suppressing the fears that they should allow to grow. So again, courage isn't just overcoming fear, it's cultivating those fears that are good to have. But yet, that involves taking those natural fears that we have and suppressing them. And the two greatest examples, again, are the ones that will keep us from doing the right thing: death and pain. These kinds of things do need to be suppressed because they will paralyze us from doing the right thing. They will prevent us from doing the right thing, and it's obvious why. But again, does this mean that we should become fearless of death, fearless of pain? No. These kinds of fears are important to keep us cautious, to keep us so that when we do the right thing, we do it in a wise way that doesn't jeopardize us or our friends, because Aristotle says it's not right for us to simply throw away our lives when it will be useless and won't achieve the good. And so, thus, our third thing, all fear should be moderated. The good fears too. It is possible to fear too much what is going to happen to our loved ones, when indeed there's no harm going to come to them. And so thus we have the helicopter parents, right? That fear for their children so much that they prevent their children from experiencing the kind of suffering that's good for them. And thus they become parents that hurt their children because they have too much fear for them. Or those who have too little fear of death and pain will charge a machine gun nest, get themselves killed, and won't accomplish the mission. And so these kind of fears are not wrong, they just need to be suppressed to the right amount so that we can act. And so thus, we're not only talking about cultivating the right fears, suppressing the wrong fears, but also moderating them so that we feel neither too much fear nor too little fear, that we fear at the right time, in the right situation, for the right things. Now, when I fear too little, then I become foolish. He calls that rashness. But when I fear too much, then I become a coward. And as a coward, I therefore avoid anything that's going to cause me pain, suffering, or possible death. Now, this tells us a lot about the importance of life for Aristotle. Life is important because it will help us become excellent humans, good people, but not so important that when we fear losing our lives, it destroys our excellence and goodness. And that is why Aristotle believes that suicide is always wrong. Why is it wrong? Because the motive for suicide must be the avoidance of pain and suffering. I contemplate suicide when I think I'm miserable and life or whatever situation I'm facing is too much to face, and so suicide is a form of escape from suffering. But if courage is the facing or going through suffering for a good or noble thing, then the act of suicide must be an act of cowardice. But then what about the person who jumps on the hand grenade to save his buddies? that person is not committing suicide. Yes, they are killing themselves, but they're not doing it to escape suffering. They're doing it to achieve a noble end. They're doing it to save that which is valuable and lovable. And thus, they are not committing suicide. They are sacrificing their life. So the difference between suicide and a noble death for Aristotle is not what you do, it's why you do it. It's the motivation behind it. And so again, courage isn't just simply being brave, overcoming fear. It is cultivating your fears so that you do the right thing at the right time in the right way to the right amount. And that requires that you have the kind of attitude that does have fear. Fears in the right amount.